What I'm going to do is present a list of general guidelines and some principles about the best methods and techniques to use while you're developing a controlled vocabulary thesaurus. We're going to be covering about 5 different sections. First, we're going to talk about what types of resources you can collect for a controlled vocabulary. Next, we'll be going over techniques and implementations for how to compile and filter those results in order to kind of merge them into somewhat final project or somewhat semblance of a vocabulary. I'll also be detailing ways to make sure that every single term in the thesaurus fits a specification and a specific need for the implementation of the taxonomy. We'll also cover different ways to evaluate this initial build of a thesaurus, best practices and techniques for kind of reviewing the entire hierarchy and the entire controlled vocabulary, and we'll finally be going over the final review and submission and proper ways to maintain and develop a thesaurus. So we have a need to create a taxonomy. We have a large array of content that's coming in, and we can't classify it with our current methods. So we want to take all these pieces that we have and then kind of combine it into this singular vocabulary thesaurus. So it might look like you have a whole list of building blocks or Legos, and they're all neat, compact, fine form, and we can mold these how we want. But in reality, it's a little more tragic. The information you're going to be processing and kind of ingesting is going to look like a garbage heap. And what I'm going to go over is some of the best methods of trying to filter out the trash, see if there's some sparkling gem or diamond tiara within this trash heap. So before we even begin to develop a thesaurus, we need to know certain number of levels of information about the thesaurus. First, how are we using it? Is it going to be implemented into a content management system? Are we hosting it on SharePoint? Are we using it with another piece of software, or are we using it with data harmony? It's how is this thesaurus going to be used for indexing content? Is it going to be describing a product listing? A lot of these will dictate the nature of the thesaurus. Second is, what is the size and the scope of the project? And when I say project, I typically mean the project of developing the source. So when I say project, just remember it's kind of synonymous with thesaurus. But the size and the scope is determined by how much content the thesaurus is processing, and that's going to enable you to realize that how many words does the thesaurus need to contain. Is it going to be a simple vocabulary for about 100 to 200 words? Is it going to be simple like a product listing? Or is it going to be more complex? Is it going to describe 50 years of academic papers published within our company? And the third criteria that you need to know is who's going to be viewing and accessing the vocabulary. If the thesaurus is running on the back end, which is normally what we recommend, it's not limited by any certain constraints. It's not limited by how deep is the hierarchy, what is the level of specification we can have. Additionally, how can we describe synonyms and related terms. And we're not limited by bogging down typical normal users with how descriptive and complex the thesaurus is. And the final part is, how often is the thesaurus reviewed? So if it's reviewed quarterly, you have some level where you can you have this flexibility of this thesaurus that we have people reviewing it, every so often, or is this going to be set in stone for 1 to 2 years? That might dictate a little bit longer for the project time, trying to get it as perfect as possible. Also realizing that it's not going to be that flexible. In terms of simplicity or complexity of a thesaurus, you have simple pros and cons. For simple, you have easily identifiable terminology. It's very straightforward for navigation. You have broader sections that drill down to narrower sections within the taxonomy, and it's not too heavy. So if you have a 100-word vocabulary, it's really easy to review every single term in the thesaurus. However, you run into the area of broad and somewhat ambiguous and general categorization, where it doesn't really describe every single article or every single detail in a publication that you're indexing. You're also lacking a lot of the control of the vocabulary, because a lot of these terms might be used interdisciplinary or used in interdisciplinary areas, and so you're going to get a lot of mishmash, and it's not going to be really descriptive of the content. Additionally, if you're having other people review it, such as a subject matter expert, they will notice the lack of descriptiveness of the vocabulary. They'll complain, why is this term not here? And in all probability, if you're running a simple vocabulary, you're not going to be using subject matter experts. Because if you're using 100 to 200 word vocabulary, it doesn't really facilitate the needs of someone who has subject matter expertise. For that area, we'd have to go for a complex vocabulary. Now, complex vocabularies can span from 1,000 terms to 100,000 terms. And the level of complexity always compounds with the number of terms you have in the thesaurus and how many topic areas you're covering. The benefit of having a complex vocabulary is that you get really descriptive, granular areas of discussion. You have a piece of content that is running through, and it has this actual term, this lower level node term nested within it, and it accurately describes this piece of content. You have multiple ways of expressing this vocabulary, because you're not constricted by number of terms, you're not constricted by the level of specificity within the vocabulary, and you're allowed to make this huge, gigantic thesaurus. But on the other hand, that comes with a heavy price, because work compounds exponentially. If you have the difference between a 1,000-term vocabulary and a 2,000-term vocabulary, kind of differs tremendously. Compared to a lot of the 8,000 to 10,000 term vocabularies, you'll start to see why it takes 3 to 4 months to actually develop and try to get things as perfect as possible. You have multiple differences in the types of terms that are being expressed, but there's too much ambiguity, possibly. You'll have terms that are similar, but not conceptually duplicate, and it becomes harder and harder to try to classify those terms. And eventually, if you're working in a larger vocabulary, it's kind of hard to pick up everything. You might have a little bit of mistakes and a little bit of blemishes here and there. It's usually involved in the overly descriptive content. A lot of papers that are published with, how many terms that some author added his whole thesis on this one subject, but Google can't research it. You can't find out what it is. Only this author knows what it is. So you get these really, really overly descriptive terms that no one has any idea what it's about, but it doesn't accurately reflect all of the content. So here we'll have, and this is taken from IUPAC Gold, which is their constructed ontology. So you see one term pointing to two nodes, and it starts off simply, but then you get to the second area, and it kind of spiders off a bit. But then when you decide to add more complexity, it can get kind of unruly. So a couple of approaches to taxonomy design are what we kind of refer to as top-down and bottom-up. Realistically, it's not the top-down and bottom-up computer science techniques, but it's kind of used in our own ways in-house. So for the first way to kind of identify key areas of the vocabulary, we have a top-down approach. Now, the top-down approach is identifying key concepts before you even create the vocabulary. You decide your main areas, ranging from 8 to maybe 12 domains, and then you can drill down from each section subcategories based on those top categories. And it's very easy for simple vocabularies to have this top-down approach. Now, when you establish the attributes of each term, you want to make sure that the hierarchy is consistent, and a lot of these properties are created when you create this drill down list. The second approach is bottom up, and this is taking a collection of data, parsing it through, and then kind of scrambling into that Lego list or that trash heap. From there, you sort the terms based on their appropriateness of the content and the thesaurus. So you move terms based on their broader and narrower categories. You declare top domains after either every term has been touched or possibly 90% of the terms have been moved into their appropriate categories. And so you let the content describe accurately what the vocabulary is going to be. So there's a couple benefits and cons to each of those. Top-down is really easy for one, simple vocabularies, two, potentially product listings, and three, if you have small scale subject and you have one person working in a thesaurus, they're easy. It's easily identifiable to take these terms and arrange them in this type of order. It's also good for creating a kind of a backbone for the top subject categories, because a lot of the work that you have for bottom up involves going through this unsorted list, and it becomes kind of mind-numbing when you first see it. But for bottom up, if you're working in a large project, say 2,000 to 80,000 terms, you need a bottom-up approach, especially if you don't have pre-existing taxonomies that you're working with. So bottom-up is really, really great for large-scale projects, and if you're creating a brand new project from scratch. And at the bottom, I listed, we recommend a mix of both, but every vocabulary demands different courses of action. It's kind of a cop-out on my part to say that we use both, but it really does change depending on the project that you're working on. We always go for a top-down approach for defining the top 8 to 16 categories, depending on the subject area. But for most of the legwork, if we're working from scratch, we always go bottom up. We always import this gigantic flat list of XML terms, of spreadsheet terms, and then we'll fold them into their appropriate categories. So the first topic, what types of resources we should look for. So we have existing control vocabularies. If we have an additional taxonomy, or if we're retiring a controlled vocabulary, that is the first place we look for. If we have, maybe we can investigate additional taxonomies to maybe fold into our subject areas. If it's already been written and the work has been done for a taxonomy, sure, we'll go ahead, take it, and maybe incorporate it into our own. You also have classification schemes. you have, so you might use Library of Congress subheadings. You might use, or one of the clients was using the Physics and Astronomy Classification System, or PACS, and that had to be folded into its own taxonomy, but we started with that general structure of their hierarchy, of their classification scheme, just to get a sense of how we're going to structure this as it's appropriate for their organization and whether or not they're going to like it. Some of the other areas you can use are, sitemaps and glossaries and definitions are great areas for resources. One, you already have a scope note defined for that term and how it's used. Additionally, occasionally glossaries or sometimes back-to-book indexes will contain your associative relationships. So your see alsos are going to be added as related terms, and that's a lot of the work has already been done for you. And that's fantastic. The second resource you can use, and this is an unsorted list, is a list of every single author entered or indexer entered keyword for every piece of content. Now it's going to appear as a gigantic flat list, and it's going to range in size from, and I put 100 to 100,000 terms. Margie and I did a consulting job for this insurance company, where we're looking at the keywords that they were using to describe all their technical documentation. And it was about 2.5 million keywords were added, and so a lot of the documentation was getting mixed up, and a lot of those keywords lists would need to be sorted out. So keep in mind that listing of keywords isn't limited to 100,000 terms, but that's generally the idea of what we're looking at. For an unsorted list, we have search logs, which is very, very, how do I put it, messy. When we look at search logs, what we're trying to identify are areas that people are searching for, topics of new interest, topics of repeat value, and just search terms that are always entered but maybe not quite met. So when you look for search logs, ideally you're looking at your most frequent 50 searches, or your most frequent 100 searches that people have performed in the past year or decade. If you go a bit longer than that, then you start to uncover very, very weird topics that people are searching for within a system. And kind of the key idea for search logs is you need to trim those search logs before you enter them into a vocabulary. What we've also done in the past is use a bit of data mining. So we've run, to identify maybe new topics or topics that weren't defined in any pre-existing vocabularies, we'll use Ingram tests. So we'll do a 2-gram or a 3-gram or sometimes even a 4-gram and see the probability of these terms that are popping up and whether or not they have indexing value. And a lot of these data mining sets maybe come later after the project, kind of adding on to the vocabulary, adding on to an existing vocabulary, just so that we don't get a lot of, junk sent into the thesaurus. What we were kind of calling this was a content-aware vocabulary. So the vocabulary or the thesaurus is using its terms pulled from the data and running that back into the thesaurus. So what do we need to do before we start compiling all these resources? And then maybe we want to make sure that these data sets that we're working with are somewhat filtered and they're standardized according to how we're going to build this thesaurus. So the first point is, how do we classify these terms and categories? And Alice presented a nice clear-cut forms of how terms should be expressed, how they are used in relationship with one another. And so we want terms that follow a certain standard, terms that follow roughly the same level of specificity, and we want to get rid of broad and generalized categories. So we're going to take every single piece of unsorted list and kind of standardize them to our student. From these lists, look for descriptors. We're going to look for terms that accurately describe the content. In this example, we're going to use this thesaurus to index the past 50 years of our content. So we want to find terms that accurately do that in 5 to 10 descriptors. What we'll also look for is maybe new and emerging technologies and concise definitions, or not even definitions, concise expressions of each term. A lot of the general categories and applications, which a lot of people have added over the past couple of years, are not terms that we want in the thesaurus. One, because they're too ambiguous. Applications can mean a computer application, it could be an applied science, it can be desktop icons. Applications refers to so many principles that it's ridiculous to insert into a controlled vocabulary. Another thing about general categories is that we don't add general into a thesaurus unless you're talking about 4-star general. We don't add general because that term does not offer any indexing specificity or indexing value. So there are 3 criteria that we look for when we evaluate thesaurus terms. The first, and what we consider possibly higher on the priority list, is literary warrant. Literary warrant is the justification for the representation of a concept in an indexing language, or for the selection of a preferred term because of its frequent occurrence in the literature. So items within the documentation you want to express the thesaurus. You want to take what is actually written throughout 50 years of publications, and you want to include that as a thesaurus term. The problem with literary warrant is that a lot of terms become outdated and their usage becomes retired. So if you're dealing with 50 to 100 years of content, you are going to get a lot of expressions and phrases that are no longer used by the scientific community. So that's one of the downsides to using literary warrant. But for our sake and for the initial development of the taxonomy, we'll look to literary warrant and that actual description for classifying the thesaurus terms. The next is organizational warrant, the justification for the representation of a concept in an indexing language or for the selection of a preferred term due to characteristics and context of the organization. So how the organization expresses certain context, how they define each given area, and these are kind of found within topics areas and outlines on websites and subject headings, along with topic sections within published books. Those dictate a lot of organizational areas that need to be classified, and typically when we do a top-down approach, we kind of look forward to using organizational warrant as a way of identifying the top 12 to 16 categories. And finally, the user warrant, which is somewhat found in search logs, is the justification used for frequent requests for information on the concept or free text searches on a term by users of an information storage and retrieval system. So people, if they're searching for it or if they're navigating through it and they use this maybe common language or use a more renowned form, will look towards user warrant for how they're searching for it and how they're expressing it. So a lot of the cases, we'll put user warrant at the tail end of the priority, mainly because we want this descriptive taxonomy that's represented from the content rather than what people are searching for. However, it's gotten to the point where a lot of the word usage from the literary warrant no longer applies to maybe the top 10 to, or top categories to maybe the second or third levels of specificity. And a lot of the times, user warrant for those top areas is necessary. In a lot of the cases of user warrant, if you're having a simple vocabulary, and it also determines who your audience is, if you're using it primarily as a sitemap, then you will more than likely use user warrant. But for a descriptive taxonomy reflecting the content, you always want to point towards literary warrant as your first priority. So, creating the initial build, we have multiple areas that we can compile. So for our existing vocabularies, our sitemaps, our thesauri, our topic areas, be aware of overlap, especially if you're merging multiple taxonomies together. Now, a lot of organizations have taxonomies that have different degrees of specification. They have different ways that they define terms, especially if you're working within a science or academic community. For instance, we were working with the American Institute of Physics, and I had two different opinions about how to treat plasma physics, whether or not it should be a top-level category or it should be subsumed within a fluid dynamics or fluid mechanics section. I had the people from plasma physics say it should be its top category, and people from fluid dynamics say it should be merged under fluid mechanics. The problem is they're both right, and in that case, we actually left it at the top category because the organizational warrant determined it. So a lot of these areas you have to make this weird compromise about how you're going to treat these terms. And if you're using existing vocabularies and kind of merging them into one, you have to be aware of how those terms are going to be treated and then sorted. You're also going to have varying levels of expression for similar concepts. So you have to make the decision to whether or not to merge those terms or to keep them separate. And a lot of that is splitting hairs, especially when it comes to finding which node to use or which expression to use, or to have them as separate categories. What you have to do for the unsorted lists, however, is less simple. Even though working with controlled vocabularies is not that simple to begin with. So standardize the word salad. Now I say word salad because what you're using for unsorted categories is you're getting large data sets of 100,000 terms to 1,000,000 terms compiled from keywords, search logs, and other resources that you're using to kind of mine the data and find these vocabulary terms that may have really good use within a controlled vocabulary, but a lot of them don't. A lot of the terms are, how would I say, garbage, and that kind of points back to the garbage heap from before. Is a lot of the terms from search logs do not have indexing use, either because they're using post-coordinated search, they're using like free text search, but in general, you want to mine those terms or kind of consolidate them into this list, removing plurals, removing hyphenation, and kind of consolidating them to describe one single entity, one single train of thought. And what we need to do that before we import it into our project. Additionally, we have to remove named entities if they're not warranted within the thesaurus. If you have persons, places, and things, maybe that aren't of particular interest. So if you want to have Albert Einstein as an indexing term, you might leave those in. However, if you're using a purely conceptual thesaurus based on the content you're publishing and not based on any human interest pieces or about any landmarks, then you want to remove those from the thesaurus, and you want to, or before they even go into the thesaurus, you want to remove them from the unsorted list. Additionally, we remove all forms of acronyms because we'll add those back in as we see them in the list. The reason we remove acronyms before is that normally when the acronyms are imported to the unsorted lists, they are conceptual duplicates of another existing term. Whether or not that existing term lies within the controlled vocabularies or it lies somewhere else in the uncontrolled lists. We generally get rid of acronyms unless it's something like DNA or RNA. We generally take acronyms out of these lists. What we also do for the unsorted lists is that we narrow it to like 0.01% of that list. So we filter it heavily. We only limit it to 50 or the 100 most frequent search terms. But we also do it by, we combine a lot of the conceptual duplicates within the unsorted list, and then we kind of limit that to 100 to sometimes 200 or 300. But if you go a little bit longer than that, you're going to get some very interesting topic areas that may not exist or may not exist within the content themselves. So when you import a lot of the search terms, the infrequent terms are not going to be applied to the content. So after we filtered everything, it's time to dump everything into the blender, so to speak. So you have all your list of resources. You have an XML of an existing vocabulary. You have Excel spreadsheets of search logs that you've mined and refined. You have other lists, simple text, and you want to dump these all into a project. It's going to look very messy, but I'll try to explain the best ways and maybe how to maintain that unsorted list and actually fold them into an actual vocabulary. So for the creation of the initial build, we establish primary categories for the thesaurus. We take out top 12, top 18, whatever. We do a top-down approach to identifying the major categories of the thesaurus. Second step is that we take these unsorted terms and then we kind of divide and conquer them. If we're working with maybe 10,000 unsorted terms, we'll import those and then we'll have personnel and other employees go piece by piece search into the uncontrolled list and either making merges or adding relationships to those terms and sorting them into appropriate categories. A lot of this stuff needs to be reevaluated, of course, but it's an iterative process. So during the unsorted list, or during kind of searching through this unsorted list, you don't need to stress too much about whether or not you get a term sorted perfectly the first time, because it doesn't matter nearly as much. You want to create synonyms at the time of sorting and add other attributes you see fit as well. You want to ensure that and double check for conceptual duplicates while you're searching through this list. You also want to make sure that you're using one form of standardized spelling. If your thesaurus is in English, make sure you're using American or British English spelling, depending on who your audience is. Typically, we do thesauri with North American spelling. Occasionally, we'll add British spellings as a synonym, or we'll have it listed as a synonym on the back end. You always want to check for typos. You always want to check each term for literary, organizational, and user warrant. Primarily is when you search for, or when you're reviewing this list of terms that you're added, a lot of the case you will get terms that maybe are a little too broad, a little too ambiguous, and you need to kind of remove them from the thesaurus or kind of develop them, so to speak. And remove and delete terms with little to no indexing value. So when you're searching and kind of adding properties to and attributes to each term, for synonyms we have a general 6-second rule, and that's just a rule of thumb that we use. For 6 seconds, think of every single synonym or different ways to express this term as I can. So what this does is it allows for better development of the taxonomy because you're looking at each individual node and you're deciding different ways to express this term. Different permutations, including hyphens, spaces, closed, and a lot of the times you will catch conceptual duplicates by adding synonyms. So in the instance that we're working in Maestro, if you try to add a synonym to a term but it says it's already existing, then that is your cue to merge those two terms together into one. What it also helps is that searching and adding related terms or associative relationships will kind of give you maybe a little bit more insight about the other areas and the other disciplines that are being focused within the thesaurus. So it'll give you different areas, how to deal with them, how to merge them, and different ways to classify each term, whether or not they need a polyhierarchy or an associative relationship will work fine. Adding these terms as you're reviewing them through the unsorted list is pretty significant. So what we also call it the skeleton or the skeletal thesaurus, which is what we kind of call the initial build, is the primary goal for this first crack at the thesaurus, this looking at the unsorted and sorted list of vocabulary terms, is two primary areas. We need to remove duplicates or conceptual duplicates in order to control the vocabulary. It also gives us a vast array of synonyms when we remove conceptual duplicates, and we need to reduce the number of orphan terms. So orphan terms, and when you're kind of sorting this list, you'll notice that categories have 20 to 30 narrow terms, but none of those have subdivisions. So after moving terms from the flat list and you see these orphan categories, you can then begin to reevaluate these topic areas and then kind of fold them into different subheadings. It'll also allow you to see which broader categories you can add in order to sort these into this little form factor. And it'll give you a little bit more insight about how to structure this hierarchy, and it actually looks a lot better when you don't have 20 to 30 terms nested under one category. So after you've done the work for kind of assessing the vocabulary, moving all those terms from the unsorted list, and developing the skeletal build, what you need to do next is evaluate your work. Now, the first way to do this is divide and conquer, is take all your staff members and assign them different sections. It doesn't really matter whether or not they're subject matter experts in the category. If they're familiar with it, that's all the better, but what they're primarily looking for is whether or not the terms have orphan sections, whether or not the level of depth is clear and concise, and whether or not it has spelling mistakes or it has bad terms, so to speak. But they're also used to fill the gaps of classification. So it's a reiterative process where you'll have a reviewer look at a section and kind of make subcategories based on different areas and then reclassify each topic area. So you want to ensure that there's no flat or orphan list of 15 to 20 terms. And I know I say 15, but in a lot of examples, if you're limited by size of the hierarchy, so if you only want to divide into 3 to 4 sublevels, a lot of the times you will get flat lists. If you're restricted by, say, a content management system, which we developed at Thesaurus for Ectron in the past, and we were limited by the number of levels of terms, number of synonyms, and we were disallowed polyhierarchy. Depending on what system you're using, that might have to be flexible. If you had more than 15 terms in a category, you may end up restructuring it or deleting kind of erroneous or really, really granular level topics. Additionally, when they're doing the reiterative review, you want to make sure that no conceptual duplicates exist within that literature. Now, when you're sorting through that flat list of terms and someone's moving it to a certain topic area, the person who eventually reviews that topic area can see every single term that was added. So it gives a little bit more, they're allowed to see the conceptual duplicates a little easier after they've been sorted. If they weren't dealt with at the time, then now when they do this first review or second review, they can see these conceptual duplicates and then either merge them or remove them from the thesaurus. What you're also doing is deleting terms with no indexing value. Again, adding synonyms where someone may have not added them within the 6-second rule, just to give a little bit more in-depth and kind of definition and descriptiveness to the taxonomy. And you can also add different related terms if you see they don't appear when you're doing the final or doing a first or second pass at a category. And you can also add polyhierarchy if you feel the need. You also have to keep in mind that each term must represent a single train of thought. It has to represent one idea and one idea only. A lot of the times when we're reviewing vocabulary lists, we'll get a lot of pre-coordinated indexing terms. So we'll get terms like acoustics and music, acoustics and biology. In a lot of these cases, you can use, you can describe content with both terms or with narrower types of terms. So if you have acoustics and biology and it's referring to echolocation, why not just use the term echolocation? It describes the content with much more clarity, then avoids using this kind of long-winded phrase of acoustics and biology, and it gives a more descriptive thesaurus. If you have terms like cancer and metastasis, you have two different concepts. One is the process of cancer spreading to other parts of your organs, and the other is just the broad category cancer. So a lot of these types will kind of chop up these combined phrases and then separate them into different indexing categories. We'll also try, when we do separate these terms, we'll try to find narrower levels to more accurately describe the content of what it's talking about. Like even these cases, they're pretty broad general categorizations. Using conjunctions and thesaurus terms, I know the standards say it's frowned upon unless you're describing something that could be describing a word that could be used interchangeably. So boats and ships, if you want a general category for describing whether or not it's a boat or a ship, and you don't want to list the hierarchy of yachts versus canoes versus any type of water vessel, you might just use boats and ships, especially if it's a simpler vocabulary. Because you're still representing a single train of thought, even if it's kind of a broad categorization. You're still representing watercraft vessels. Maybe you could just call it watercraft vessels, but no one's going to search for it. And it's also not listed within the documentation anywhere. Another thing is, what I try to do is reduce slang and jargon. This one is actually very, very debatable, and I don't want to say flexible because everyone has various ways to express terms, but in the case that no one uses the old phrase anymore, like DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid, might as well just use DNA. That's another instance where user warrant kind of supersedes literary warrant. Although, in the case of the recently published articles, you might find DNA is listed within the documentation as well, so it has literary warrant as well. But the examples I listed are microelectrical mechanical systems and MEMS. You can also do bioelectrical mechanical systems and MEMS. The first part we do is use it the way it's kind of written within the document, where it's first line where it's written out first and then it's used the acronym. We'll always use the written out form as a taxonomy descriptor or thesaurus descriptor. We call this like the basis for literary warrant, where it accurately describes this term and we're not using an acronym to kind of cover for it. However, over the recent years, people have been saying MEMS and biomems a lot more, so this might change, and it might change depending on the organization, how you're reviewing the thesaurus. If you want to use biomems and you're very adamant about it, then feel free to just kind of change the term. And like I said, a lot of these categories are up for debate, but when we do the initial build of the thesaurus, we'll go for the written out form. Kind of the same is true for quantum bits and qubits. Since we're reviewing 50 years of physics and quantum mechanics documentation, we found out a lot of the research contained the words quantum bits. But over the recent years, people have used the shorter qubits to describe the content. And so that's one of the areas that we've said that, okay, the shortened form supersedes the literary warrant. But the literary warrant for the recent years has been moving towards qubits. So the shortened expression, the abbreviations, neologisms, all kind of take the shortened form, and I'll have precedence over the retired or older expressions. So other things you need to review for are nouns and noun phrases. Never, even when you're going through sorted and unsorted lists, make sure that every term is a noun and not a verb. So you use catalysis over catalyze, distillation rather than distill, and analysis over analyze. I mean, these are also broad categories, and they could be kind of refined different, like what type of analysis, maybe Monte Carlo analysis, blah, blah, blah. You can define certain subjects like that, but make sure to not use verbs. Adjectives and adverbs, I recommend against adding those to the thesaurus. Something like reading and cleaning, while they are nouns or subject terms, they are very general in how they're being applied. So a lot of these instances, you might need to narrow these topics or to rename these topics. Also, you want to make sure that if you do include named entities into the thesaurus, you want to make sure they have proper capitalization. So regular standardization for terms is make sure every term is plural and make sure it's initial case. But for proper nouns, you want the initial casing on each term or each word, just so you follow the same format. Additionally, when you're searching through the thesaurus and you find compound words and phrases, you need to have this this level of descriptiveness for each term so that you know what you're parsing. So in the example I wrote on the bottom, lead coating on copper pipes. Ideally, you want 2 terms to describe this sentence. However, if you're using a preliminary build of the thesaurus, you're going to have maybe 4 terms that kind of come up here. you'll have lead as an element, copper as an element, coating or metallic coating, and pipes. So what you want to do to get rid of these really broad and ambiguous categories is that you want to define within the thesaurus these two topic areas so that it accurately describes what the author is describing. So these are two compound phrases that are descriptive enough to include in the thesaurus. Loan words are okay if they're in the context of the vocabulary. So if you're working in a law thesaurus, you might have habeas corpus as a term. Use DNA. Abbreviations should be spelled out, but major exceptions and unfortunately highly debatable. And make sure that terms do not have parentheses unless they are disambiguating concepts. So Mercury as an element versus Mercury as a planet, that's fine to include in the thesaurus. Although if you have computed tomography or CT scans or in parentheses, it's not really accepted when you're standardizing the thesaurus. CT or CT scanning would be added as a synonym to X-ray computed tomography or just computed tomography. So one of the things is when you're reviewing this list, so we had the lead coating on copper pipes example mentioned earlier, is that we want to incorporate one of two indexing styles, and we want to use post-coordination to describe the content. So if we have post-coordination, we have two terms individually, but when they indexed in a certain document, those two terms accurately describe the content, or the single line of content. So you want your list of 10 to 5 indexing terms to reflect what's being written in the content. Pre-coordination is you define all the categories as one single node, and you don't want to incorporate these into a thesaurus. So I've used Library of Congress subheadings as an example of pre-coordination, but I've also listed an example earlier, and that was acoustics in biology, analysis of metal objects, something that can, two concepts that are conjoined within the single phrase, and unless that represents a single train of thought, we don't want to incorporate that into the thesaurus. So post-coordination, it lets Maestro and it lets us have an easier time figuring out and hammering out the details of the vocabulary. It also allows for the rules automated system to work a lot better because it's not searching and parsing the text for these long-winded phrases. So it gives us a little more flexibility of how we create the thesaurus, and it also indexes at greater degrees and levels of accuracy that we can't do with post-coordination or pre-coordination. Another setback of adding those pre-coordinated terms is, so we have computers and computer applications in pretty much every scientific field. So if you have computers in chemistry, what's going to stop someone else from creating computers in biology, computers in dentistry, computers in echolocation, computers in footwear, etc. So if you have these pre-coordinated concepts, you're going to get this large, unruly list of user-added terms that are really two separate descriptive thesaurus terms. So some key factors is keep terms plural unless you are actually changing the meaning of the word. So technology and technologies, if you make technology plural, you're describing the devices used in this category. If you keep technology as the subject topic, it has a very distinct or a different definition. Even if these two are broad categories, it still changes the meaning once you make it plural. And you want to keep the terms plural unless literary warrant or user warrant dictates that it has to be singular. It's always used in the singular form, and general expression is used in the singular form, but in the text and the user. So those are the two exceptions. You want to control the vocabulary through use of synonyms. By adding synonyms, you reduce conceptual duplicates within that uncategorized and categorized listings. And always be certain that every term describes a single train of thought. So I mentioned earlier that it is a reiterative process, and so when we do the evaluation, we do the evaluation again. So someone working in one section may move on to a different topic area. When all eyes have been glanced over each topic section at least twice or 3 times, then we feel that it's an acceptable vocabulary and that it's in good form to ship out and to implement. What we also do when we submit this for kind of a second or third review is that we consult subject matter experts. Now you may have heard us complain about, or if you've been around here, you've heard us complain about subject matter expert feedback. But at the same time, we think that information that they can provide is highly critical, especially to the success of the project, because when they're able to identify the content, they're able to, they can read the types of physics documentation, and they can provide feedback of how the indexing terms are being used. The one thing you have to remind them is what they're reviewing. So you're looking at levels of specificity and how a term is defined within the thesaurus and how it's categorized. If they have their own ideas about the thesaurus, then their opinion is going to be kind of misconstrued a little bit. So you want to make clear how these terms are classified and how they're defined in the vocabulary. If they say that a certain indexing term, no one uses this expression anymore and they use this, then that's great feedback. If they've seen how it's being used to classify the documents and they say that it's utilizing too many broad areas, we've narrowed this section down to this, and this, then that's great too. An example of working with quantum mechanics over the past 50 years. Long time ago, they just called it quantum mechanics. Now, if you index something with quantum mechanics, you have this huge array of documentation saying multiple different things. So you have to have these levels of specificity according to the subject matter experts. In a lot of the cases, sometimes if their opinions don't match the scope of the project, then you have to take their opinion with a grain of salt. If it's going to interfere with the thesaurus, such as adding the computers in footwear term to a thesaurus, then you might need to not do it.